What did we learn about WNBA All-Star Weekend? And what went on the ground in Las Vegas? Annie Costabile of the Chicago Sun-Times was there, but now she is here right now to discuss what she saw and what she felt in Las Vegas. The Locked On Women's Basketball Podcast, it starts right now.
Ogunbowale for the win. Good!
You are Locked On Women's Basketball, your daily podcast on women's basketball.
And welcome. You are locked on to women's basketball. I'm Jackie Powell. I'm one of your Friday hosts. I cover the New York Liberty at the Next. I help with the Next social media strategy, and I've covered women's basketball nationally at many other places. We want to thank you for making Locked On Women's Basketball your first listen every day. And remember that Locked On Women's Basketball is brought to you by everyone at the Next, which is a place where we cover women's basketball all the time. We tell the stories that need to be told every day. And if you subscribe now, you can get 27% off our typical price in honor, of course, of the WNBA's 27th season. And so you can get a subscription for $52.56 for a year rather than $72 for a year. Also, Locked On Women's Basketball is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, all of those podcast formats. So, last time you and I were together, listeners, I had Lucas Seehofer on to discuss his WNBA injury tracker and why it's important and why it matters. But today, Annie and I are going to chat about the evolution of WNBA All-Star and sort of where she saw the most change from year to year. Then we're going to get into some news that came out of All-Star. And then finally, we're going to discuss the future of WNBA All-Star as it will go to Phoenix in 2024. But Annie, hello, welcome. I am so happy to have you on. I think where I want to start is just simply what was different about All-Star Weekend in Vegas this year?
Well, for me, this guy had one All-Star versus four. So that was the biggest difference. No, jokes aside, Ka obviously made her third straight All-Star appearance. That's what brought me to Las Vegas. And I would say the biggest difference that I noticed was just the God, how do I say this? The spectacle of it all. Like Kehlani performed at halftime. The WNBA Live was this massive space in Mandalay. From start to finish, there was just a spectacle happening somewhere. And the WNBA obviously was at the center of it. The WNBA was the spectacle. So there just was, there was a clear priority made to make the event the highlight of the weekend. And it was clear that, NBA Summer League wasn't going to mess with it. Like it was the highlight of the weekend in Las Vegas from, Thursday to Sunday.
Yeah. I mean, I remember that was sort of the deal in 2021, although in 2021, the COVID restrictions were so tight and WNBA Live wasn't really a thing. I mean, it made its debut in Chicago a year ago, but there were clearly some hiccups. So I guess when it comes to WNBA Live, what differences did you see from year over year?
Well, just the amount of people that could enjoy it. I mean, in Chicago, there obviously were more than a few hiccups as far as people being able to get access to the entire weekend of events. There was no issue whatsoever in Vegas as far as that goes. So, I mean, WNBA Live was just completely different. It was an entire, like, how do you describe it? It was like an entire room of space, like a convention center room, of space with all these different booths set up and meet and greets set up. And like, it just from start to finish, like I said, was a party. So even if let's say you didn't have a ticket to the game or the skills competition, you still very much felt like you could be involved in WNBA All-Star. And that wasn't the case, obviously, in Chicago. I think a lot of people's biggest issue with Chicago All-Star Weekend was the lack of opportunity to participate, to enjoy, to meet players, to engage with the WNBA. And here it was like the WNBA was everywhere. It was like pop, 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 everywhere. From the moment you landed, like it was All-Star everywhere. So
that's really interesting. One of my memories from 2022 All-Star was the fact that the Pampered Chef convention was sort of everywhere.
Right. If you're getting outdone by Pampered Chef, like there's clearly something amiss with the handlings of All-Star. And I will say, like, I'm not here to completely drag like the 2022 All-Star experience. I think a lot of people enjoyed it. I mean, Sue Bird, Candace Parker, like some of the league stars talked about how much fun it was because they felt like for the first time they were able to create parties and establish like this that similar energy to NBA All-Star. And so I think Chicago was great for a lot of reasons. It set a new standard, but it definitely, had its issues as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to remember that the years 2020 and 2021 into 2022 we were still trying to figure out how to get out of COVID. I mean, I think a reason why those parties didn't really happen, but also in 2021, it was sort of right before the Olympics. And so it will be interesting, and we'll discuss this later, but it will be interesting to see post-COVID how the W does an All-Star before the Olympics, because we can even see in these first couple of games of the second half of the season, players are sort of dealing with that All-Star hangover.
Totally. Oh my God, totally. I mean, I'm dealing with an All-Star hangover. Are you kidding? Like, absolutely. Oh my God, absolutely.
So I'm just curious, when you reflect, like when you walked in and walked away, what do you think that All-Star accomplished?
I think, again, it was like another opportunity for the players to be centered and like feel as they should all the time, like they are the greatest athletes in the world, right? Like All-Star is a time not to take things too seriously. The only thing that should be taken seriously, and this is just my opinion, is the stardom of these players. Like these are your All-Stars. These are, as voted by media, fans, and coaches, the top of the league. So from start to finish, they should be celebrated, and not only celebrated by the league, but absorbed by the fans and the city as such. And I think, again, from start to finish, I mean, I guess you would have to get players' opinions on that. But just as an outside observer, it seemed like from start to finish, the players were treated and were propped up and elevated in a way that they should be and should always be. So to me, yeah, I think that was that was a great quality of the All-Star weekend.
Yeah, I mean, it just, in addition, obviously, to having BG there for all of it, there wasn't sort of this heavy looming issue that was being discussed. I mean, I remember back in Chicago.
Oh, you don't think James Wade resigning mid-season was a heavy looming issue? I'm just kidding.
Well, no. Well,
I'm joking. Like league wide, of course. Sorry.
It's just, no. We will discuss that in segment 2. But I just remember there was a press conference with the Reverend Al Sharpton and NECA a year ago, and it sort of added this like a heaviness, and you're sort of saying like All-Star, it needs to be fun. And I feel like with BG like clowning on Chelsea Gray and, even what Sabrina was able to do and the fact that these players could actually meet their fans like that, I feel like that has been missing, and it makes me so glad that has been rectified, and hopefully it will continue to be.
Absolutely. And I just want to clarify, I was by no means like comparing James Wade's resignation to obviously the significance and heaviness of last year's All-Star game and everything that the league was facing as far as Brittney Griner's wrongful detainment. Absolutely not my what I was meaning to do there. But I will say, like, having BG back, everybody was so happy. Like, everybody was so happy. And I think that's been felt all season. Each time, obviously, any opponent is playing Phoenix, like there's new hugs had, and everybody's just so excited to see BG. But this was everybody collectively celebrating BG being present and how far things have come over the last year. And to your point, you're right. Like, this was the first time in a few years that there hasn't been something significant hanging over the All-Star weekend. Again, was not trying to compare James Wade's resignation to COVID or any other significant moment in WNBA history, but it was like the first time in a few years that there was no outside force that players needed to speak on or needed to put themselves in vulnerable positions about. It felt like a true moment to celebrate everybody being together. And I think that was really special.
Yeah. I mean, of course, obviously, we appreciate the WNBA because of how its players are very bold and how they speak on certain things. But I think it's an absolute interesting point, an interesting idea to bring up, that this was sort of the first year in a few years where, okay, they could take a deep breath, they could have fun. And, obviously, I think the social justice theme this year is maternal health. And I think we'll start to see some of those things in different team markets come up. I mean, obviously, when the Commissioner's Cup comes around, just making sure we ask those players exactly, what they're playing for. But anyway, we are going to take a short break, but coming up, we're going to talk about some of the big news that came out of All-Star Weekend, which has some Chicago ties, obviously. But first, I want to chat with y'all about FanDuel. So let me pull up the FanDuel overlay. Anyway, so take your first swing at betting MLB on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets, up to $200. That's right. Just bet $20 and you'll land $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 that you can spend betting everything from the money line to the over-under to who you think is going to hit the first home run. All on the app that is safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you can get paid instantly. There's no better place to bet on Major League Baseball than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, an official partner of Major League Baseball. Yes. Thank you, FanDuel. All right, Annie, let's get to the news.
The news. As you can see, I'm trying to make jokes regarding all of the news that's taken place because it's been a busy few weeks in Chicago.
It has. And so I think what I want to start with is if you could take me through exactly how the Sky were able to get Dwayne Wade to commit to investing in the franchise. Because that's a big deal.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it starts with Dwyane Wade's advocacy, from top to bottom. Dwayne's a very involved person in the community, in many communities, right? Like he's based in LA, but he's from Chicago. He's also lived in Miami, and he is a very vocal person when it comes to human rights issues, and him and his wife, Gabrielle Union. So I think it starts with that, right? Because, the alters and the ownership group in general have always been very vocal about finding the right kind of investors. And I think a lot of WNBA franchises, I would argue all of them are going about trying to find investors that align with the WNBA's values, right? So I think it starts there with Dwayne being someone who's not trying to put on a front like he aligns with the W's values. He just does. And so when you see someone like that, you're paying attention, it becomes a no-brainer, or you'd hope it becomes a no-brainer if you're a fan of this guy that the ownership group would want to include someone like that. So after speaking with Dwayne, I learned that this has been a conversation for some time now. He was approached by Michael Alter and Nadia Rawlinson at the NBA All-Star game in Utah. And even before that, he had heard rumors that they were going to, or I guess I shouldn't say rumors. He had heard kind of rumblings that they wanted him to join their ownership group. So when they approached him, it wasn't a complete surprise. At least that's kind of how he described it in our brief conversation at All-Star game, or at the All-Star game. So those conversations obviously have been happening for some time. And then from there, it progressed to him meeting with the ownership group and meeting with players. And so from my, what I've witnessed with my own eyes was obviously him coming out to Saks Recreation Center. And he was, toured through the facility by Michael Alter himself. And that's not happening unless you're unless you're knee deep in, the possibility of investing, possibly already had by that point, like that's kind of, to me, was just the tail end of it. And obviously, Michael didn't want to confirm at that point that, Dwayne had invested. Dwayne didn't confirm at that point that he had already invested, but he wasn't coming out to Saks Recreation Center just to be like, hey guys, nice to see you. Keep up the good work. So I think that moment really signaled that it was more than just interest, even though that's when they started alluding to, oh, he's just interested. And so from there, we got the news that it was official. And I think that, it really falls in line with what the ownership group has been saying about wanting to take the franchise to a new level. Now it's about action. So even with these added investors, names are great. Dwayne Wade, clearly the magnetism, I wrote about this, is huge. But what are you going to do actually? And that's not even a question just to Dwayne. It's what are you going to do with this investment? That's a question to the entire franchise. And now Dwayne as part of that franchise. So names are great. Obviously, Laura Ricketts and the group of 6 women that invested are impeccable as well. But again, that's not enough. And now it's about where do you go from here? What do you do with it? And how do you ensure that this momentum you've gained from these added investors isn't lost over the course of the next year?
Yeah. I mean, the next thing I wanted to ask you about this was what type of influence you think he's going to have going forward. Because, I mean, he was interviewed by WNBA Countdown, and he was very open about things I haven't really seen Chicago Sky ownership be open about, saying things like, we have a lot of work to do. There's no secret about the amount of work we have to do. Kalia Copper is a free agent, and we have to be cognizant of that.
So I am excited as a journalist to be able to kind of document some of this stuff, because you're right. This ownership group has really bristled at any type of criticism, whether they believe. Well, no, I don't think they've ever really believed that criticism was just when it was being hurled at them, whether it's coming from, whoever it's coming from. I think that this franchise hasn't handled criticism very well. And when it comes to bringing in a person like Dwayne Wade or like Laura Ricketts, for example, they very much understand what it takes to be a championship contending franchise consistently. Because even if you look at the Chicago Cubs, right? Like they won the World Series in 2016. Mm-hmm. And then it's been, a downward spiral since then. But there's still a professionalism that exists there. There's still a franchise that's attracting top free agents. There's still the Chicago Cubs. And so to establish yourself as that type of franchise, even in the losing years, takes a lot of work. And so then you bring in a player or a person like Dwayne Wade, a businessman like Dwayne Wade, a champion, a 13-time All-Star. He knows from a player perspective and as a businessman what it takes to establish that type of culture and sustain it, right? Sustaining that type of culture is what the emphasis is on. And so I think when you bring in a voice like Dwayne Wade, you're bringing them in knowing that they're going to be vocal, and you don't ignore a voice like Dwayne Wade. This is a 3-time champion, one of the game's greatest. I mean, he's being inducted into the Naismith Hall of Fame. Like, you cannot ignore a voice like that. So you don't even go pursuing a voice like that unless you're willing to hear everything that he has to say. So now it becomes how involved is Dwayne going to be, right? Because again, he has a voice you have to listen to, but that requires his voice being present actively. And so that's not to say that he doesn't intend to be that way. Again, in our limited conversation, he said he's going to be as involved as they want him to be. And the franchise echoed that, saying he's going to be as involved as he wants to be. So it sounds like he's going to be involved. But again, until there's action backed up behind the language, it's just, we can't say for sure. But yeah, again, you don't bring in a voice like Dwayne Wade's for him to be some silent partner in the back. Like, he's coming in to, as I wrote, be a conduit between the players and the ownership, and in a way that they have not had in the past. So,
absolutely. Dwayne Wade knows what professional amenities look like. He knows how that's supposed to feel. And it's fascinating because the Sky have done a lot when it comes to building their new and improved ownership group. And I just have a question for you, Annie. Has all of this been approved by the Board of Governors yet? Is it a fait accompli? I mean,
Dwayne's investment is absolutely still needs to be approved by the Board of Governors, and to my knowledge, so does the other investment group's investment. So that's the next step. I mean, there's no reason it shouldn't be, but it still is awaiting approval, to my knowledge.
For sure. It's so interesting how quickly they've moved. and how they've gotten so much done since Nadia Rawlinson was announced as the chairperson and co-owner. I mean,
Right.
what really, just from your vantage point, what has been her influence? Because she's just got so much done.
Yeah, I mean, Nadia is a force. Like, Nadia has come in and I think been this vocal leader from a front office standpoint, from a management standpoint, from a business standpoint, and addressed what needs to be addressed, taking questions on what questions need to be answered. Like, I think for a long time, and I've only covered the Sky for I don't know how many years now, but and Michael Alter's always been an owner that I could get in contact if needed. There's been varying degrees to that, of course, but I think for Nadia, what's been apparent for me as a journalist is she's very front facing, and I think the Sky needs someone who has her background and her skill set and her intelligence and her, like, again, she's a force. It's a huge asset to have a person like that who's making moves and talking about them with the media. Like, I think in the past, again, I can only speak to my experience, things have maybe happened that have gone by the wayside because we didn't hear about them or ownership didn't talk about them necessarily. And Nadia's a voice who, again, from my experience, understands and really takes advantage of the momentum that's been building. And that's what it is, right? Because all of these moves make our steps to making a franchise relevant. And Nadia for sure seems to understand that. Like, she's been great to work with in my experience, my short experience so far. So yeah, I mean, that's my opinion on it.
Yeah, not just making a franchise relevant, but making it sustainable, which is
right.
what you alluded to before. It's been quite dramatic in that you had this, essentially, it was a 2-year window where the Sky were championship contenders. And then a lot of interesting things happened as a result. And so clearly that there is the front office, there is high alert here on how, so many, I guess, positive things came during that championship window, and knowing that certain things have to be done in order to keep the momentum going instead of taking steps back.
Yeah, I just want to add to that point, though, that championship window was a credit to Sloot staying, Allie staying, and Candace joining, right? Yeah. That was the players who developed a 2-year championship window. The franchise did not develop a sustainable championship culture, no matter who wants to say that they did. That was a 2-year window, credit to Candace Parker coming home. If Candace Parker's from New York, if Candace Parker's from Seattle, if Candace Parker's from Connecticut, who knows what happens, right? Like, and it also is a credit to James Wade for being the coach. And I've written about this a number of times, the coach and the GM with enough gusto, with enough, obviously, like, as much as we've said about his GMing skills, a coach who was capable of coaching a group of stars to a title. So again, that's why we saw such a brisk downfall, is because the championship culture wasn't sustainable because it was built by players, not by the franchise. And that's the difference, right? Like, if you want to be a championship, again, like the Cubs, and maybe some people will disagree with my take here, but there's a level of opulence, of decadence that exists within the Cubs organization that, win or lose, there's still an attractive place to be. That has yet to be established here.
That is an excellent point. That is an excellent point. Before we talk about All-Star in 2024, because that was also some news that we got as well, I do want to quickly touch on what was, I thought, a really interesting way of talking about WNBA expansion. I mean, obviously, Kathy Engelbert addressed the media right before the All-Star game itself, but there were players that were talking about this during the press cycle before. So I'm just curious what you made of that. I mean, Kelsey Plum sort of said, like, I don't think we're ready for expansion right now.
I didn't take necessarily Kelsey's statement as we're not ready for expansion, but she was like, if we're going to expand, then y'all need to do X, Y, and Z for us, because if you can bring expansion, then you need to take care of us in the process. So I think she's like, what I'll say is this. I think it's really says something about the league that the stars of it are vocalizing their thoughts in the way that they are. There's no reservation. There's no, and why should there be, right? And so I'm not trying to speak for players in this like statement or this thought that I have, but there's there's a new sense, at least from a media perspective, in asking some of these questions. There's a true sense of ease from players of vocalizing what they expect as professional athletes. And I think that that's really valuable. And I haven't seen that in my time covering the league, or even as a fan when I was younger, like it was, and I keep going back to Kelsey's statement of, if you're going to expand, well, then we need charter flights. We need an increase in pay. Like that's the way Kelsey answered that question is the way any other athlete in any other league would answer a question if they felt that there was a lack. Right. And so, and I'll, go to certain questions I've asked in Chicago of like, what is your expectation? How are you feeling about the fact that you guys are the last remaining franchise with a GM head coach? Like, does that bother you? Does it make your job difficult? Like, what are your thoughts? And to get players' genuine reaction is valuable, because ownership hears those things, the league hears those things. So I think that the vocalness on issues that are important to players is really valuable. And I think that Kelsey's obviously not alone. I mean, she was sitting right next to Chelsea when she took that question, and Chelsea was agreeing with her. And, in my experience since, following up with players on the Sky, I think there is a sense that if you're bringing in new franchises, but the standard isn't where it should be yet, then are we going to see success there? Or is it just going to be kind of the same issues for these other franchises? Or is the expansion of new franchises going to demand, because we see what's going on in Vegas, like if certain franchises elevate to a certain point, well, you're not going to be able to compete unless you meet them where they're at. So if these new franchises come in and they're of that same standard, well, then, will that elevate other franchises that are maybe comfortable with staying in the middle of the pack?
That's an excellent point. What I thought was really interesting about that is how NECA then responded to that. Because as we know, NECA is Madam President of the Players Association, and KP is now her new first VP. And so just looking at what NECA said, what was so fascinating is she started talking about obviously how both charter flights and expansion need to happen, but it almost seemed like she was taking the expansion route out of the franchise expansion route. Because what she said, and I'm going to read this because it's fascinating. She says, but it kind of sheds a light on kind of the general perspective on what needs to be handled first. Do we need to handle the things that we're currently experiencing before we add more teams? And will that also and that will also be experiencing the same stuff? I think so. One thing that is really for me that just bothers me, and maybe it's because I'm feeling it more, because I'm on a team experiencing it. We've had so many hardships signed. And not only do we have hardship because people get hurt, but you also have the hardship counting off the cap. So by the time you get these people back, you were so far over the cap that we've only had one in-season trade. That's the excitement of the league, being able to see that type of movement. So, I just think there are a lot of things we can talk about that can also contribute to the expansion that we want to see. So there was a lot in that quote. I mean,
Totally.
She was even talking about potential roster expansion and how, okay, if you have more spots on each team, then maybe you don't have these hardships. Or if it's an issue of certain franchises maybe can't afford extra spots, you maybe give them an option. You say, okay, would you like to operate in the hardship system, or would you like to have an extra spot? That's something that I've thought of. But what are your thoughts on Nneka's response there?
Well, Nneka's brilliant. Like, you're never going to get the detail that she can always provides in her responses to questions about any major topic like expansion or the salary cap or charter flights. Like, she's such a valuable resource as a media member. So completely unsurprised by the detail and the layers to her response, because there's a ton of layers in there. But I think that Nneka is also so good at vocalizing the desires of many players, because again, in her answer, it's like there's a lot of answers in her answer. And so the thing that stands out to me is that a lot of players do feel that roster expansion is more valuable than league expansion. And so Nneka vocalizing that again is just another opportunity for the league to either prove that they're listening to its players or they're ignoring them. And so maybe it doesn't need to be one or the other. Maybe with league expansion, they're also going to announce roster expansion. Who knows? But the value is in the players taking the opportunity to vocalize in a transparent way what their desires are for the league that they are building. This league is being built by them. So if they're not vocalizing what they want, what they expect, then it gets built in a different direction. So I think Nneka vocalizes what a lot of players feel, is that roster expansion is more valuable than league expansion at this moment. So we'll see, what comes of that. But again, it's an opportunity for owners, for the league itself to either listen or ignore what its players are saying.
Yeah, I mean, we talked earlier a bit about what is the purpose that All-Star is supposed to serve. And so in addition to what you were saying when it comes to giving the athletes, I guess, the top spot on the pedestal and elevating them in a certain way, it's also about talking about the state of the league. And it's also about asking them important questions about the state of the league. So yeah, I mean, that's what All-Stars should be. And it seems like that was accomplished. Now, let's talk about the future of All-Star. So, Kathy Engel, off air, Annie, you and I were talking about how I was sort of unsure about this. But first, I sort of want to hear about why you think Phoenix makes sense as the next destination. And then I'll provide why I'm a little bit skeptical.
Yeah, so I think what needs to be understood is that ownership has a lot to do with the execution of an All-Star game or an All-Star weekend. So when people are saying how wonderful All-Star weekend was in Vegas, it has a lot to do with the ownership in Vegas. So when you look at Phoenix and the new ownership in Phoenix, I think that's why, in my mind, this makes a lot of sense, because it's following up one following up a great All-Star weekend with one that we would all assume is going to be handled the same way. So, and that when you consistently provide that experience, well, then that sets the standard that the only locations that are going to get an All-Star weekend are going to be locations that could execute it to this level. So I think that's why, for me, when I think about All-Star being in Phoenix, I immediately thought about the ownership in Phoenix and how they have the ability, the capacity to execute on a very, elite level. I also think announcing it a year in advance is the move. Like, what are we doing? You don't announce an All-Star weekend months in advance. You announce it a year in advance. So I personally was offended by them announcing it because I was looking forward to breaking another All-Star weekend announcement. But kudos to the league for announcing it a year in advance.
Yeah, I mean, that I agree with you on the front of, yes, announce it a year in advance every single year. That should be the standard now, because that also publicly, that tells your fan base also that, the league takes this event very seriously. And there's a lot of logistical pieces that make All-Star weekend the pomp and circumstance that it is and that it should be. But I think the reason that my opinion differs a little bit is just because of the state of the Phoenix Mercury in general. And the fact that they right now, sure, their owner is one that cares much more about his WNBA franchise than his predecessor. But at the same time, they're going through a change. When you go through changes, a lot of the times owners sort of have to look around and see what's going on and what's happening. And it was very striking to me that there was just this assumption that BG was going to return, that BG was going to be on the Phoenix Mercury in 2024 when her contract was only for a year. And the Phoenix Mercury are still, I believe, in 11th place in the league. And so it's like the last few years for All-Star, it's happened in cities and places where the WNBA teams have either been defending champions or have been very much so winning teams. And so it came across as a little strange to me with this franchise that is in transition. There's no fault of their own. It's just the state of how things are. And then I sort of thought, I was like, well, okay. Diana Taurasi, she, as of now, is planning to play in the 2024 Paris Olympics. Diana Taurasi she will be under contract in 2024. I just wonder, is this sort of a celebration, DT's legacy send-off type of thing?
I mean, it writes itself, right? That makes complete sense. But to your point about like the Mercury being in a state of transition, I think that this honestly signals, in my mind, a step forward, because as you've mentioned, the All-Star game has or I guess not historically, but the last few years has been in locations where the team just won a championship, or the team has some huge draw, or there's some like stardom factor surrounding the team. Well, look at the NBA. Like the Utah Jazz just hosted All-Star weekend. Where were they at when they hosted it? Like they were at the I don't know. I don't know where they were at, but they were definitely at the bottom of the league or the bottom of their conference. So I don't think that the team hosting All-Star has to be anywhere in the standings. I don't think they have to be at the top. I think they could be where they're at, because it's not about the team. Like All-Star weekend wasn't about the Las Vegas Aces. Okay, they happen to have 4 stars playing in the game, which definitely, contributed to Aces fans getting hyped up about it. But the All-Star game being in Phoenix doesn't have to have anything to do with Phoenix. It's about the league. And if done right, if executed right, well, then the league is celebrated right. And the league's stars, who may or may not be on the Mercury, will be celebrated well, So I think, again, like money solves a lot of issues. And this new ownership group, Mercury's new owner, sure, you make a great point about, it not being maybe a seamless transition, but I still think regardless of that, they can execute a All-Star weekend well if, invested in properly, if the right moves are made as far as ensuring that it's an excellent weekend. And yeah, again, I just feel like, moving forward, that's kind of what contributed to these late announcements of All-Star weekends. Like, you can't predict if a team's going to be in a good spot or not, and nor should you. Like, I don't think All-Star weekends should be contingent upon or hinge upon how well a team's doing or how many stars are on that team. Like, All-Star weekend should go to the franchises, to the owners, to the people who can execute All-Star weekend how it should be executed, who can prop up the league stars how they should be propped up during a weekend of celebration for the league. All-Star weekends don't have to do with any single team in particular, in my opinion.
I totally get that. I also think having it it will be interesting to see how the city of Phoenix is involved in this. I mean, the thing about Las Vegas is, as you said, the entire city and this massive entertainment capital knew that the WNBA was there. I don't know if the city of Phoenix has that ability, if that makes sense. But then again, there have been All-Star games that have taken place in Uncasville, Connecticut. That has seriously. And they did it because the Mohegan Sun Casino had the space to be able to put on that weekend. And as we saw, or as you saw, because you were there in person, having the convention centers and the casinos in Vegas, that opened up a lot of space to do more event programming. But anyway, we want to thank you for making Locked On Women's Basketball your first listen every day. I want to give a huge, huge, huge thank you to Annie for hopping on to the show and talking basically a post-mortem of All-Star. And please follow her on all of the interwebs at Annie Costabile. I can spell it for you all. It is ANNIE COSTABILE. Yes, for those of you who are not watching on YouTube. And tomorrow, on Saturday, our WNBA draft and pro player development scouting crew return with their series WNBA Retrospect. And so they're going to be looking at the film of Ticha Penicheiro. Yes, the guard with so much European flair. Well, this has been Jackie Powell and
Annie Costabile.
And we are signing off. We hope you have a wonderful, wonderful weekend.
Ogunbowale for the win.
You are Locked On Women's Basketball, your daily podcast on women's basketball.